在这段长达近半小时的视频中，美国著名政治学家约翰·米尔斯海默以一种极具洞察力，但也充满美国中心视角的口吻，讲述了他眼中中美博弈的逻辑。他坦率地承认，不仅仅是美国，几乎所有中国的邻国都怕中国。而在这句话背后，其实折射出的是一个更深层的现实：美国正在用恐惧中国的框架，重新构建他对整个亚洲的战略叙事。米尔斯海默在开头就直截了当地说，他的理论来自5个简单的假设，把它们放进搅拌机混合之后，得出3种行为模式。这3种模式解释了为什么各国总是在竞争、恐惧，甚至对抗。他说，世界的本质就是一个极度竞争的竞技场，每个大国都想成为街头最强最狠的角色。在这个体系下，没有裁判，没有仲裁者，更没有世界警察能永远维持秩序。听起来像是在讲理论，其实每一句都指向现实。这是一个以美国为代表的超级大国如何理解中国崛起的思维底层。
It's all about. My theory begins with 5 simple assumptions about the world. And I take those 5 assumptions and I put them in the blender and I hit the on switch, mix them up, and get 3 forms of behavior. And what those 3 forms of behavior tell you is that we live in a very competitive world where great powers compete with each other to be the biggest and baddest dude on the block.
第一个假设，无政府的世界。米尔斯海默解释说，在国际体系中，国家是唯一的主要行为体，而体系本身是无政府状态的。这里的无政府并不是混乱，而是没有任何高于国家的权力机构。这意味着任何国家的命运最终都只能由自己决定。这种无政府状态的假设奠定了他整个理论的基调：恐惧、竞争、自助。
First assumption is that states are the principal actors in the international system, and that system is anarchic. That means that there's no higher authority that sits above states. Anarchy is the opposite of hierarchy. Most of you probably think anarchy means murder and mayhem. That's not what anarchy means in my story. Anarchy in my story is simply the opposite of hierarchy. It says that there's no higher authority that sits above states. States are the principal actors in the system, and they're like pool balls.
第二个假设，所有国家都有进攻性能力。米尔斯海默认为，所有国家无论大小都拥有一定的进攻性军事能力。即便是像比利时、危地马拉这样的小国，他们或许军力有限，但依然可以对邻国造成某种威胁。而像美国、俄罗斯、中国这样的国家，就拥有足以影响全球安全格局的硬实力。他指出，这种力量的存在，使得各国之间永远不可能完全信任，因为在一个没有中央权威的世界里，进攻性能力本身就是潜在的威胁。
All states have some offensive military capability. Obviously, a country like Belgium, a country like Mozambique, a country like Guatemala has very little offensive military capability. And in contrast, countries like the United States, countries like Israel, countries like Britain, countries like Russia have considerable offensive military capability. But the point is, every country has some offensive military capability.
第三个假设，永远无法确定他国意图。你永远不知道其他国家在想什么。这是米尔斯海默整个理论中最关键的一条假设。他用一个生活化的比喻来说明这一点，就像婚姻一样。当人们结婚时，都相信对方是值得托付的伴侣，但美国的离婚率高达50%，这说明人连枕边人的意图都看不透，更别提国家之间了。这句话引来全场笑声，但背后其实是冷冰冰的现实主义逻辑，意图无法被验证，军力才是唯一的确定性。在冷战时期，美国人对苏联的军事力量了如指掌，知道它有多少架战机、多少枚导弹，但却永远搞不清赫鲁晓夫或勃列日涅夫心里在想什么。这种不确定性就是国家间彼此恐惧的根源。
Third assumption, which is of great importance, has to do with intentions. Remember, the first assumption was that states are the principal actors and they operate in an anarchic system, no hierarchy. Second was all states have some offensive military capability. Third assumption has to do with intentions. And there the assumption is you can never be certain about the intentions of other states. Now, this is an enormously important assumption in my theory, and that's why I want to spend a couple minutes unpacking it, this assumption about intentions. The reason that intentions are so difficult to divine is because they're in the heads of policymakers and you can't see them. They're very different than capabilities. During the Cold War, when we used to look at the Soviet Union, we used to be trying to figure out, number one, what were Soviet capabilities, and two, what were Soviet intentions. Capabilities were never hard to figure out. We could see these material capabilities. We could count how many attack submarines, how many SS-18s, how many Foxbats, how many armored division equivalents the Soviets had. We had a really good sense of what their capabilities were. We could never figure out what their intentions were. We had huge debates as to what was inside Nikita Khrushchev's head or what was inside Leonid Brezhnev's head. Some people said X, some people said Y, others said Z. You just couldn't know because you can't see them. So intentions are very hard to divine. Now, some people would disagree with me on that. Say you can get a pretty good sense of what intentions are today. My Sunday punch in response is, even if you think you can figure out what intentions are today, there's no way you can know what future intentions are. There's no way you can know what future leaders of any country will be thinking. And a good example that illustrates this has nothing to do with IR, has to do with divorce. Think about divorce. When two people get married, they invariably think that the person they're marrying is wonderful. I mean, who would get married to someone you didn't think was wonderful? You think that person has benign intentions towards you, right? Well, you know we have a 50% divorce rate in America. That means that 50% of the people are guessing wrong, right? That means that they think they're marrying a person who's going to think they're the cat's meow, as my mother would say, forever and ever. And that proves not to be the case. This is actually a very depressing thought. But if you think about it, you can never be certain that the person you're marrying won't turn out to be Attila the Hun. Now, I want to be clear. This is not to say you can be certain that the person will turn out to be Attila the Hun, because after all, 50% of the people do live happily ever after. It's just to say you can't be certain that that person won't turn out to be Attila the Hun. And the same thing is true with regard to the intentions of states. You cannot know, I believe, what the intentions of states are now, but you certainly can't know over the long term. Okay? So three assumptions on the table. The system is anarchic. Got states in this system as the principal actors, and it's an anarchic system. They all have some offensive capability. And number three, you can't be certain about it.
第四个假设，生存是首要目标。国家可以有很多目标，但如果不能生存，其他一切都毫无意义。米尔斯海默强调，这个假设几乎是政治现实主义的基石。生存优先意味着一切战略行为，包括军事扩张、结盟、制裁、谈判，都可以归结为为了活下去。而在美国眼里，这正是他们看待中国的出发点。中国越强，美国的生存焦虑就越强烈。
Which will be commonsensical to all of you folks, is that the principal goal of states is to survive. And this is not to say that survival is the only goal. It's to say it's the most important goal. And it's the most important goal for the obvious reason that if you don't survive, you can't pursue the other goals.
第五个假设，国家是理性行为体。这意味着各国都会像下棋一样算步数，哪个策略能让自己活得更稳，就选哪个，不会干赔本赚吆喝的蠢事。
Fifth assumption is states are rational actors. States are strategic calculators. This is a way of basically saying that states are good at figuring out clever strategies for maximizing their prospects of survival. It's the rational actor assumption.
于是，这五个假设被丢进搅拌机后，米尔斯海默得出了三种行为模式：恐惧、自助、权力最大化。这决定了大国怎么打交道，也决定了中美为什么会博弈。第一种行为模式：恐惧。国家彼此害怕，因为没人知道邻居是希特勒还是朋友。在这种不信任的环境中，每个国家都被迫保持戒备。他打趣说， 如果你的邻居是个有核武的强国，还天天对你笑，你敢睡个安稳觉吗？他补充一个关键点，更要命的是，国际社会里没有110时，遇到危险没人来救你，因为没有更高权力机构能管这事。所以这种恐惧不是多余的，是真的会要命。这种恐惧构成了他理解中国崛起的第一层逻辑，美国害怕的不是中国已经做了什么，而是他可能会做什么。这是典型的防御性焦虑。
You take them in the blender, put them in the blender, you hit the on switch, you mix them up. You get 3 forms of behavior. First is states fear each other. They fear each other because there's always the danger you'll end up living next to a state that has significant offensive military capability and malign intentions towards you. Because you can't be certain about intentions, and some states have a lot of offensive capability. You end up living next door to Adolf Hitler, end up living next door to Imperial Japan. It is not going to be pretty, right? So that's the first reason you fear other states. The second reason is, in the international system, when you dial 911, you know who's at the other end? Nobody, because it's an anarchic system. There's no 911. So you fear other states. Obviously, that level of fear varies from case to case, but fear is always there.
第二种行为模式，自助。在国际政治中，当你拨打911时，是没人接电话的。这句话让现场观众一片哗然。米尔斯海默的意思是，在无政府的世界里，没有更高力量可以保障你的安全，唯一能依靠的只有自己。就像乌克兰的例子，他们希望美国能保护自己，但真到关键时刻，美国会不会真的为乌克兰拼命？没人敢确定。所以各国都要自救。在美国人看来，中国正是在用自己的方式发展军力、巩固经济、强化科技自主，实现自助。
The 911 problem points to the second form of behavior. States quickly figure out that the best way to survive in this system is to depend on themselves. The international system, as we say in political science speak, is a self-help system. Or as my mother used to say when I was a little boy, God helps those who help themselves. That's how the state system works. Why? Because you can never trust that somebody will be there for you. If you're a Ukrainian, are you going to trust the Americans? Please, you don't trust the Russians? You don't trust anybody. Do it for yourself. Provide for your own security. It's a self-help.
第三种行为模式，权力最大化。米尔斯海默接着说，各国在自助的过程中，很快会意识到一个事实：最安全的方式就是成为最强者。这也是他最具争议的观点。现实世界的逻辑不是合作，而是权力竞争。他拿美国举例，你们谁会担心加拿大或墨西哥打美国？根本不可能，因为我们在西半球最强，军力、经济都碾压周边国家，所以没人敢惹。这就是当区域霸主的好处，安全有保障。美国的霸权来自这种逻辑，而中国的崛起也正是按照这套逻辑在运作。
States in this system quickly figure out that the best way to survive is, to use rhetoric I've already used, that we used in New York City when I was a little boy, is to be the biggest and baddest dude on the block. Because if you're the biggest and baddest dude on the block, nobody fools around with you. How many of you people go to bed at night worrying about Canada or Mexico attacking us? Have you ever thought about that? You worry about Canada or Mexico attacking us? Or maybe you worry about Guatemala? Or the Dominican Republic? Come on. It's inconceivable that any state in this region would attack us. Why? Because we are incredibly powerful. In an anarchic system, where you cannot be certain about the intentions of other states, you want to be extremely powerful, because it's the best way to survive.
米尔斯海默进一步拆解美国的霸权目标：第一步，先当自己家门口的霸主；第二步，不让别人当其他街区的霸主。用五角大楼的话说，就是不能有势均力敌的竞争对手。因为如果别的地区出了个霸主，他就会像美国一样到处逛，跑到我们的后院来捣乱。
I believe that no state can become a global hegemon, simply because the globe is too big and there's too much water. I believe that the best you can do is be a hegemon in your region of the world. You dominate your region of the world. And this, of course, is what the United States does. The United States is the only regional hegemon in modern history. We dominate the Western Hemisphere. But the goal is to be a regional hegemon, to be so powerful that you don't have to go to bed at night worrying about anybody in your neighborhood attacking you. But you have a second goal. The second goal is to make sure that there is no other regional hegemon in the world. To put it in Pentagonese, you want to make sure you don't have a peer competitor. You want to make sure that Imperial Germany does not dominate all of Europe. You want to make sure you, the United States, dominate the Western Hemisphere, but nobody dominates their region of the world the way you dominate yours. Now, you're probably saying to yourself, I can understand, given what John has said about anarchy and uncertainty about intentions, why you want to be a hegemon in your region. But why does it matter if you have a hegemon in another region? It all has to do with the concept I call freedom to roam. Most of you have never thought about this, I'm sure. One of the reasons that the United States is running all over God's little green acre, sticking its nose in everybody's business, is not simply because we're powerful, but because we're free to roam. We have no security threats in the Western Hemisphere. And because we have no security threats in the Western Hemisphere, we don't have to commit any forces, we don't have to commit resources to this region. We're free to roam. And we roam all over the place. Just think about, you're in China. You're looking out along your coastline. You see the U.S. Navy out there. You see the U.S. Air Force out there. You see Army troops in Korea. You see ground troops, Marines in particular, in Okinawa. You go to Europe. The Americans are in Europe. The Americans are in the Gulf. The Americans are here, there, and everywhere. Why? Because we're free to roam. Well, if you're the United States of America, you don't want anybody else to be free to roam. Why? Because they'll roam into your backyard. Right? So what my theory says is that if you're a great power, you have two goals. One, to be a regional hegemon. And two, make sure you have no peer competitor. There's no other regional hegemon. That's my theory. And it's based on those five.
他提到，美国从1783年独立后，花了几十年时间扫平北美大陆，往西抢印第安人的土地。1840年代跟墨西哥打仗，抢了西南部。1812年还想吞并加拿大，后来没成。到1898年打完美西战争，把欧洲列强赶出西半球，才算真正当上西半球的霸主。他还提到门罗主义的本质。1823年，门罗总统就放话了：“这是我们的半球，欧洲别来插手。”其实就是告诉别人，西半球是美国的后院，谁也不能进。冷战时，苏联想在古巴搞事，美国气得跳脚，就是因为有人闯后院了。
1783 to the present. When the United States got started, after we won our independence from Britain in 1783, we were comprised of 13 measly colonies strung out along the eastern seaboard. Over the next 60-plus years, we marched across North America, murdered huge numbers of Native Americans, stole their land, went to war with Mexico in the 1840s, stole from them what is now the southwest of the United States. In 1812, we invaded Canada with the express purpose of making Canada part of the United States. The reason that Toronto is not the capital of Canada and Ottawa is the British, who ran that place at the time, expected us to pay a return visit, and they didn't want the capital close to the American border. They wanted it further back. That's why Ottawa is the capital. We had a voracious appetite for conquest. We wanted the Caribbean very badly. The southern states were desperate to move south, and the only reason we didn't move south, the only reason the Caribbean is not part of the United States today is because of the slavery issue. As many of you know, sugar was the principal crop in the Caribbean. Sugar is even more labor intensive than cotton and tobacco. That meant there were even more slaves in the Caribbean than there were in the American South, and the northern states did not want any more slaveholding states in the Union. That's what held us up from going south. Right? We had a voracious appetite for conquest and annexation. It's no accident that when Adolf Hitler went into the Soviet Union on June 22nd, 1941, for the next few months, he talked frequently about imitating what the Americans did. He said, these are people who know how to create Lebensraum. He referred to the Volga River as our Mississippi. For purposes of creating regional hegemony, we not only had to conquer all of that territory in North America, that was called Manifest Destiny. We also had another task, and that was to throw the European great powers out of the hemisphere and keep them out. You all know that in 1823, old President James Monroe basically told the European great powers, we're not strong enough to throw you out now, we're eventually going to throw you out, and we're not going to let you back in. This is our hemisphere, and you are not welcome here. That's what the Monroe Doctrine was all about. It wasn't until 1898 that we finally finished off the Spanish and the Spanish-American War, and we clearly established hegemony in the Western Hemisphere. The British were gone, the French were gone. There were no European great powers left. And there are enough people in this audience who are old enough to remember during the Cold War when the Soviet Union used to monkey around in Cuba. You remember how that used to drive us stark raving crazy? Who are these people to come in our hemisphere? We own the Western Hemisphere. That's what the Monroe Doctrine is all about. So the Manifest Destiny policy and the Monroe Doctrine policy, that was the essence of establishing.
他举了历史案例，美国历史上一直在干这事：一战打垮想称霸欧洲的德意志帝国，二战打垮想称霸东亚的日本帝国和纳粹德国，冷战拖垮苏联，都是为了不让其他区域出现能跟美国叫板的霸主。
Now, as I told you, great powers have two goals. One is to establish regional hegemony. And two is to make sure you don't have a peer competitor. In the 20th century, after we established regional hegemony, we had four potential peer competitors: Imperial Germany, Imperial Japan, Nazi Germany, and the Soviet Union. The United States played a key role in putting all four of those countries on the scrap heap of history. In the spring of 1917, when it looked like Germany might win World War I, we intervened, and I would make the argument if I had 3 more hours that we tipped the balance in favor of the Allies and helped defeat Imperial Germany. We were not going to let them dominate Europe. In World War II, we beat the Japanese single-handedly in the Pacific. We had no intention of letting Japan dominate East Asia. And with regard to Nazi Germany, we played a key role. The Soviets, of course, played the key role, but excuse me, the United States played a key role defeating Nazi Germany in World War II. And then during the Cold War, we played the principal role containing the Soviet Union, and then when it collapsed, we ushered it down the toilet bowl. And shortly thereafter, the George H.W. Bush administration made it clear that we were number one, and we had every intention of remaining number one. So what I'm trying to say to you here is, if you look at American history in a cold and calculating way, it's quite clear that the United States has behaved according to the dictate.
所以他认为，中美博弈不是意识形态之争，也不是个人恩怨，而是美国的霸权逻辑遇上中国的生存需求，再加上安全困境的放大，最终形成的结构性矛盾。美国有门罗主义，不让别人插手西半球，中国为什么不能有自己的门罗主义？中国人记得百年国耻，1850到1950年，中国弱的时候被日本、美国、欧洲列强欺负，现在强大了，自然不想再让外国军舰在自己家门口晃悠。他站在中国的角度分析，如果你是中国的国家安全顾问，总统问你怎么对付美国军舰，你肯定会说把他们赶到第一岛链外，再强点赶到第2岛链外。这不是中国好斗，是任何国家都会做的自保选择，就像美国不允许别人在西半球驻军一样，这是美国绝对不能接受的，所以才要重返亚洲，拉着日本、印度、越南一起围堵中国。
Again, we're assuming that China continues to grow economically. You don't think China's going to try to dominate Asia? You know, the Chinese refer to the period roughly between 1850 and 1950 as the century of national humiliation. China was very weak. You know what happens when you're very weak in the international system? Other states take advantage of you. The Japanese, the Americans with their open door policy, the Europeans, they all took advantage of the Chinese. They did terrible things to the Chinese. The Chinese remember it. This is why Chinese nationalism is such a dangerous force today. That century of national humiliation, nausea, death. Well, getting back to the realist story, the balance of power story, you don't think the Chinese are going to care greatly about being so powerful in Asia that nobody can fool around with them again? I bet they are. I bet they're really going to care. You go up to your average Chinese policymaker and you say, you have two choices. Choice number one, China can be 20 times more powerful than Japan. Choice number two, Japan is 20 times more powerful than China. Do you think it matters? What do you think the Chinese policymaker is going to say? He's going to say, we'll take that first option every time. We want to be much more powerful than Japan. We remember what happened the last time we were weak. What about the Americans in East Asia? You think the Chinese are happy about having the Americans running aircraft and ships up and down their coastline? You think that makes them happy? It doesn't. We have a Monroe Doctrine. You don't think they're going to have a Monroe Doctrine? They're already talking, the Chinese, about pushing us out beyond the first island chain, and then when they get powerful enough, pushing us out beyond the second island chain. It's Monroe Doctrine mentality. I don't blame them one bit. If I was the national security advisor in Beijing and the president asked me what we should do with the Americans, I'd say we should figure out how to get them out of here. The same way as if I was in Washington, I'd be a staunch proponent of the Monroe Doctrine. I don't want the Chinese, Germany, Soviet Union, Japan, I don't want anybody monkeying around in the Western Hemisphere. Why? Because the best way to be secure in an anarchic world where you can't be certain about the intentions of other states is to be a regional hegemon. So why shouldn't the Chinese have their own Monroe Doctrine? Why shouldn't they try to push the Americans out? As my mother taught me when I was a little boy, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. Well, if it's good for us to have a Monroe Doctrine, please explain to me why it's not good for them to have a Monroe Doctrine. They're going to have one, believe me. They're going to try and dominate Asia, and they're not going to want us in their backyard. If they do dominate Asia, and this is going to be a very powerful country if they grow economically, right? If they dominate Asia, they will be free to roam. And they will roam into the Western Hemisphere. And this will not make us happy. See? So that's why we, and this brings us to the Americans, this is why the Americans will go to great lengths to prevent China from dominating Asia.
那如果中国经济继续增长呢？随着经济实力逐渐转变军事实力，下一步就是主宰亚洲。美国不会任由事态发展的。米尔斯海默透露了美国的小动作。我们现在在缅甸下功夫，想把他从中国那边拉过来。菲律宾以前把美国赶出去，现在又主动请美军回来。越南还在谈让美军用金兰湾，这些都是在打反华联盟，目的就是不让中国在亚洲当霸主。
Again, we're assuming that China continues to grow economically. You don't think China's going to try to dominate Asia? You know, the Chinese refer to the period roughly between 1850 and 1950 as the century of national humiliation. China was very weak. You know what happens when you're very weak in the international system? Other states take advantage of you. The Japanese, the Americans with their open door policy, the Europeans, they all took advantage of the Chinese. They did terrible things to the Chinese. The Chinese remember it. This is why Chinese nationalism is such a dangerous force today. That century of national humiliation, nausea, death. Well, getting back to the realist story, the balance of power story, you don't think the Chinese are going to care greatly about being so powerful in Asia that nobody can fool around with them again? I bet they are. I bet they're really going to care. You go up to your average Chinese policymaker and you say, you have two choices. Choice number one, China can be 20 times more powerful than Japan. Choice number two, Japan is 20 times more powerful than China. Do you think it matters? What do you think the Chinese policymaker is going to say? He's going to say, we'll take that first option every time. We want to be much more powerful than Japan. We remember what happened the last time we were weak. What about the Americans in East Asia? You think the Chinese are happy about having the Americans running aircraft and ships up and down their coastline? You think that makes them happy? It doesn't. We have a Monroe Doctrine. You don't think they're going to have a Monroe Doctrine? They're already talking, the Chinese, about pushing us out beyond the first island chain, and then when they get powerful enough, pushing us out beyond the second island chain. It's Monroe Doctrine mentality. I don't blame them one bit. If I was the national security advisor in Beijing and the president asked me what we should do with the Americans, I'd say we should figure out how to get them out of here. The same way as if I was in Washington, I'd be a staunch proponent of the Monroe Doctrine. I don't want the Chinese, Germany, Soviet Union, Japan, I don't want anybody monkeying around in the Western Hemisphere. Why? Because the best way to be secure in an anarchic world when you can't be certain about the intentions of other states is to be a regional hegemon. So why shouldn't the Chinese have their own Monroe Doctrine? Why shouldn't they try to push the Americans out? As my mother taught me when I was a little boy, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. Well, if it's good for us to have a Monroe Doctrine, please explain to me why it's not good for them to have a Monroe Doctrine. They're going to have one, believe me. They're going to try and dominate Asia, and they're not going to want us in their backyard. If they do dominate Asia, and this is going to be a very powerful country if they grow economically, right? If they dominate Asia, they will be free to roam, and they will roam into the Western Hemisphere, and this will not make us happy. See? So that's why we, and this brings us to the Americans, this is why the Americans will go to great lengths to prevent China from dominating Asia. Okay? So I'm telling you that what Chinese will do, if they continue to grow economically, is they'll translate that economic might into military might, and they'll try to dominate Asia. And what the Americans will do is the Americans will try to contain them and ultimately wreck them. That's what we did with Imperial Germany, Imperial Japan, Nazi Germany, and the Soviet Union. You think we're going to let them dominate Asia? Think we're going to stand by and let that happen? You've all heard of the pivot to Asia. What do you think the pivot to Asia is all about? We're pivoting to Asia for a very good reason. We're scared of the Chinese. And by the way, we're not the only country that's scared of the Chinese. Virtually all of China's neighbors, except for North Korea and Pakistan, are scared of China. You can see the balancing coalition already beginning to form. For those of you who have doubts, go home and Google Japan and India strategic cooperation. Japan, India strategic cooperation. Google it. You'll be amazed at how many articles come up. Japanese and the Indians are talking. The Americans and the Vietnamese are talking. Vietnamese have been talking to us about coming back to Cam Ranh Bay. Philippines. When the Cold War ended, the Philippines said adios to the Americans. Don't come back. They're singing a completely different tune now. Go to Singapore. Very different world. They're all nervous. Can you blame them? They are living next door to a very big and very powerful country. The balancing coalition will be South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, of course the United States, Vietnam, Singapore, Indonesia, Malaysia, Russia, be the balancing coalition. Myanmar. For those of you who have doubts, just watch the newspapers over the next 2 years and watch us working on Myanmar. What we're trying to do with Myanmar now is peel them away from the Chinese. Right? The Chinese and the Burmese have been quite friendly for a long time, and we're trying to peel away Myanmar.
接下来的事态发展趋势就更不难理解了。中美会走进竞争的死循环，最危险的安全困境，你防我，我防你，最后擦枪走火。一个国家出于防御做的事，在另一个国家眼里就是进攻。比如美国说重返亚洲是为了遏制中国，是防御，但中国看在眼里，就是美国在围堵自己，是进攻。他举了具体例子，中国觉得美国在亚洲增兵是进攻，所以加大军费造军舰、战机。美国看到中国军力增强，又觉得中国在搞进攻，于是再增兵，卖武器给盟友，双方都觉得自己是防御，对方是进攻，最后军备竞赛越来越激烈，擦枪走火的风险越来越高。他警告，虽然有核武器的威慑，大规模战争的可能性不是特别高，但危险性绝对不低。中美之间的误解和猜忌，就像滚雪球一样，会越滚越大。
So what I'm telling you is that as China continues to rise, what's going to happen is you're going to have an intense security competition. The Chinese on one side and the Americans and their Asian allies on the other side. Now, what's going to make this an especially intense competition is what we call in international relations the security dilemma. The security dilemma basically says that anything that one country does for defensive purposes appears offensive in nature to the other country, and vice versa. Let me give you an example. The pivot to Asia. If you were to ask Barack Obama, is this offensive or defensive in nature? He would say, of course, behind closed doors, because we're not allowed to talk publicly in an honest way about what we're doing here in America, right? He would tell you, again, behind closed doors, that we're pivoting to Asia for purposes of containing China, and it's being done for defensive reasons. And I believe that he genuinely believes it, and I believe that from an American perspective, it's correct. But if you're sitting in Beijing and you see the Americans pivoting to Asia, it does not look defensive in nature to you. It looks offensive in nature to you. And the Americans say, well, it's just containment. The Chinese say, it doesn't look like containment to us. When I listen to John Mearsheimer talk, it sounds like encirclement. Before World War I, the French, the Russians, and the British put together the Triple Entente. The Triple Entente was designed to contain, to deter Imperial Germany. If you were sitting in Berlin in those days, what you would say is, these countries are not containing us, they are encircling us. Moscow used to say the same thing during the Cold War. Just to switch gears a bit, let's go to Beijing. Beijing sees what's going on, sees that its neighbors are increasingly distrustful. The Japanese are spending more money on defense, the Americans are pivoting to Asia. So the Chinese say what we have to do is spend more money on defense to defend ourselves. Well, what does the Pentagon interpret this as? They're building offensive military capability. This is evidence that they have aggressive intentions. Remember, I told you, you can't tell what intentions are. Intentions are very hard to read, but you can see capabilities. So what happens is the Chinese see American capabilities increasing, the Americans see Chinese capabilities increasing, and because they can't really figure out what intentions are, they use capabilities as a proxy. Okay? This is the essence of the security dilemma. And the end result is that both sides are going to spend a lot more money on defense, and each side is going to interpret the other side to be doing it for offensive purposes while they're doing it for defensive purposes. This is the security dilemma. So what that is going to do is it's going to fuel the arms race. It's going to fuel that competition. And it's going to make the likelihood of war reasonably high. Not very high. We do live in the nuclear world, but reasonably high. It will be very dangerous, like the Cold.
视频最后，米尔斯海默明确表示，中美博弈不是谁对谁错的问题，而是现实主义国际体系下的必然结果。只要中国继续崛起，美国就会持续遏制，这种竞争会长期存在。整个视频中，米尔斯海默始终站在美国视角，用冷酷理性的逻辑拆解中美博弈，没有情绪化的指责，只有对权力规则的剖析。这种视角虽然带着明显的美国立场，却也让我们看清了美国制定对华政策的底层逻辑，为理解中美关系提供了重要参考。